Hi, it's Drake. I had been seeing some things about books and difficulty lately, specifically one video that I was extremely disappointed by the book chemist about the recognitions. And difficulty in books is something I think about sometimes, and something I'm forced to think about more than I would like, because it seems that for whatever reason, most of the books that I enjoy are ones that other people consider difficult. So I'm constantly, forced to think about the disconnect that I have with these people and try to imagine their mindset on things. So, the book chemist video misrepresents the recognitions and Gaddis so egregiously that my sense of justice couldn't really just let it pass without me saying at least a little something. So I'm going to focus on dismantling that video first, and then move into a discussion of difficulty in books in general after that. So I'm going to put in case you're not interested in the first part, which I wouldn't blame you, I'm going to put a timestamp of roughly the time that I'm done talking about the book chemist video. And then if you just want to watch the stuff about difficulty in books in general, that'll be there. So, yeah, so about 2 weeks ago, the book chemist, who I really never watch anymore because, speaking personally, his videos have taken a sharp drop in quality. I used to watch his videos pretty regularly, maybe 7 years ago or so, before I even made my channel. I mean, I think he was one of the first people to just make videos about books on YouTube, like this. And I would watch his stuff on and off. He talked about some interesting books and some books that are not interesting to me at all. And, but then kind of got away from it. The way I kind of view it to myself is I completely outgrew his view of literature and the books he reads and things like that. But anyway, so that's kind of the background I have. And then also, Gaddis is one of my favorite writers. And I've made videos about Gaddis. I think about Gaddis a lot, and my views on Gaddis diverge significantly from many people's views of him. And so that's a little bit of a background of where I'm coming from for this video. But yeah, I'm just going to go through. I wrote a couple notes here of quotes from his video so I can respond specifically to things he said, which is actually surprisingly lacking from his video. He doesn't quote anything out of the recognitions, even though he supposedly read it. I wonder if he's speed reading or something. But because he says some pretty strikingly negative things about it with zero evidence. So that's one of my main critiques with his video, that basically he's like, he might say one token positive thing about the book, oh, it has a nice writing style. And then he'll say it's like immensely homophobic and transphobic with no evidence. So he's implying that, oh, by the way, guys, this book is really hate-filled and homophobic and transphobic, but good luck, find it in the 956 pages if you want to see if that's true. Which is extremely disingenuous, first of all. And I'm sure he wouldn't like it if someone did it to a novel he happens to enjoy, such as, something by Pynchon, or slandering a McCarthy novel that way. So the first question I would have as an actual question is, why was he reading the recognitions? Because he mentions in the beginning of his video that, and self-deprecatingly mentions himself as a young man wanting to show off his massive intellect by reading these hard books. He got into college and, oh man, he's reading all these hard books in class, and oh man, he just wants to read hard books now, wants to prove himself to himself and to the world. He's smart, really smart guy. He wants to impress people, really hipster as he always, stuck on the word hipster, 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 hipster. He wants to be a hipster. And he's self-deprecatingly mentioning this as himself 10 years ago, as if he's somehow gotten past it. And he mentions that, he stopped buying books and he just happened to have the recognitions on the shelf. So it's like a completionist thing. He's just reading the books he has on the shelf, which makes me ask, well, why were you reading it? Were you reading it as some sort of hangover from your past life or something like that? Are you reading it because you're bored? Or are you reading it for the only reason you should actually read anything, because you're interested in it? Not because people are interested in it, not because it's written about, not because it's difficult, not because it has a reputation. Those are all bad reasons to read something, but they are generally people's reasons for reading stuff. But the only reason you should read it is if it seems compelling, it looks interesting to you. Maybe you're bored and you want something to entertain you, something like that. Those are good reasons to read. So I would ask, as an open question, why were you reading it? Because that's very important for your determination on what the book actually does. And he mentions also that he had mentally prepared himself, that he was going to give it about 50 to 100 pages before he quit. So I would think also he must have like an extensive, and I'm saying this like tongue-in-cheek, extensive knowledge of the book already before even opening it. Because he's prepared himself, okay, I'm just going to get through 50 to 100 pages, and then if I want to quit, I can quit. It's like running a marathon. I'm going to run at least half of it, then I'll walk the rest. Why would you think of it like that? Why wouldn't you just read the book? And if you enjoy it, continue, and if you don't, stop. One point connected to why were you reading it. And then also, it's obvious to me, and this is more of a general point, but it's relevant here. It's obvious to me that people who are artists, people who are writers, read books for different reasons than people who are simply readers. And this one is extremely obvious in this video because he mentions that it's almost a childish notion. It's only romantic and modernist, as if like you can compartmentalize different periods of time and it's only a valid view if you lived between 1790 and 1830 to have a romantic view of art as salvation or something like that. And now, we're past that, guys. Nothing matters anymore. World War II happened, Holocaust. How can art save us? And even then, it's like it constantly deprecates a pessimistic worldview. Well, how can you not entertain art as a possible salvation? I'm a high school English teacher. And my freshmen, 13-year-olds, were writing essays about how art can benefit society. And they were coming up with extremely valid examples of how art can be uplifting or, salvific or whatever, art as salvation. So I find it hard to believe that it's such a trivial concept. Of course, without any defense of how it's trivial or how it's archaic. Maybe it's supposed to be assumed. Maybe once you pass your PhD, you get injected with, something in your brain that makes you think that, art can't be salvation. I don't know. I don't have a PhD. He mentions continuously that it's annoying. It's annoying. Okay, that's irrelevant. He mentions that an animal crucifixion of a monkey is fun. Okay, that's an interesting version of fun. Maybe he means like, it's quirky, it's funny, yeah, crucify a monkey. He mentions that a lot of passages are funny and quotable, kind of like that typical academic thing, when I hated a book, I have to say a few nice things about it. So if anyone goes into me about it, I can say, hey, I said some nice things first before I gave my indefensible opinion. Mentioned constantly that it was difficult to follow. There's where we start to see the cracks emerge. And then gives this really petty, like childish quote here. Mentions the fact that after the first part of the book is over, and when you enter the part in Paris and then in New York, Wyatt's name is not often mentioned. And how that's, I'll just quote him, "Why would you do that, William? It's not like we didn't figure it out after a few paragraphs." Well, if you figure it out after a few paragraphs, then how is that difficult? So either it's difficult and you don't figure it out, or it's not difficult and you figure it out. Which one is it? Can't be both. And then he goes on to say that it feels difficult for its own sake. And he imagines that Gaddis is telling you to fuck off. The author tells you to fuck off, which is hilarious. Why would you write a 1,000-page book if you wanted the reader to fuck off? No explanation is given, obviously. And then the extreme irony of this whole thing, and I'll try not to go on too much longer, is that at various points in his life, Infinite Jest was his favorite book. Thomas Pynchon was his favorite writer. Gravity's Rainbow, Against the Day, all this stuff. And it's like, come on, dude. You have to have an imagination that all of your, these books that I just mentioned, Foster Wallace and Pynchon, can be given the same indefensible treatment, and it would be just as indefensible. Like, don't throw rocks from a glass castle. This should be completely obvious, but apparently it isn't. Mentions that Gravity's Rainbow, it's okay that Gravity's Rainbow doesn't make sense at certain points because it's related to drugs. And it's not okay for Gaddis to not make sense sometimes because his not making sense is based in religion, like a demonic possession or a sermon or something like that. It's like, well, why do you have that bias? Why are drugs okay to scramble the brain, but not religion as you imagine it, which I wouldn't even defend that statement of Gaddis. Because it does make sense. Or it's not disjointed. It's pretty straightforward, a lot of it. And he mentions this indefensible quote that if you want to read the recognitions, and probably almost none of the viewers of his channel live in Italy, but he's mentioned, because he speaks English the whole time, he mentions that if you want to read the recognitions, just go into a conservative Italian town and listen to the preacher, slanderously talk against, transgender and gender equality and diversity of culture or something like that. And it's like, what are you trying to say there, dude? Did you ever learn in your freshman year of high school or whatever the Italian equivalent is of an ad hominem and how that does not actually have any argumentative weight to it? So, because you could never defend the idea that that's what Gaddis is. So why would you make that connection? And then he mentions that Gaddis is homophobic and transphobic without providing a single evidence. None. Not even, in this part of the book. Nothing. So it's like, that's hilarious. That's hilarious. How can you have a PhD and get away with that sort of thing? It's indefensible. And he mentions that Gaddis has a contempt of humans and no fascination with humans. Why would you write this long book if you have no fascination with humans? Well, let's imagine the options there. Okay, so the option is that Gaddis has no fascination with humans and yet writes a 1,000-page book about humanity, broadly speaking. Okay, that's an option. Or the option is Gaddis does have a fascination with humans and you don't see it. I'll let you decide which one is more likely. And then He mentions that art as salvation is, or like the artist. He phrases it kind of like a hyper simplified. The artist is the only pure existence, and then everyone else is trying to drag the artist down, which you can't find in the recognitions at all. The only maybe mild option would be Stanley, and oddly enough, I'll mention this, that Book Chemist never mentions Otto, who is, maybe apart from Wyatt, the other main character of the first 400 pages, which is all that he read. Didn't even finish the book. He doesn't mention Otto once, which is the closest stand-in to Gaddis in the novel. Doesn't mention him once. That's weird. But he mentions that, this idea of the artist, this straw man, completely simplified version of what he imagines Gaddis is doing, is a teenage dream, masturbatory fantasy, and he connects it to the idea of salvation through art. Well, what's the point of art then? As some sort of cheap opiate that, like, you don't get addicted to physically? Or is it supposed to be confirmation bias? Is it supposed to enable social connection? What is the point of art then? And of course, there's not one point, but if art as salvation, or art as growth, or art as knowledge is not a goal, I don't know. I don't know what's the point of, like, the only reason he was able to get his PhD is because art is greater than I want to say art is greater than, the sum of its parts, but that's not exactly what I'm trying to say here. Art does lift us up. That's the only reason people have done it for the last, 20,000 years, 30,000 years. Before we had antidepressants, the only option you had is singing and conversation and art. And he mentions that the world is dragging the artist down. How ridiculous. Well, yeah, the world is dragging everyone down from the perspective of Gaddis, which is just misrepresented. Mentions predatory women. I mean, that's ridiculous. Immensely misogynistic. Keyword there is felt, immensely misogynistic. Women are either petty and stupid, like all of the men. All the men are petty and stupid. Rectal, Brown, Basil Valentine, Wyatt, Otto. Stanley isn't quite as bad. Mr. Pivner is kind of, pathetic. So is it misogynist? You'd have to defend that he is excessively harsh on women compared to men. Or they're saints, such as, there's not an example in the book. Flaunting of classical sources. Well, some people just know a lot. That's not their fault that you don't. And he mentions that it's a Beat novel because Beat is misogynist. That's just hilarious. And then he goes on and on about the Gass introduction, which isn't my favorite, but, Gass is definitely a much better reader than he is. So mentions the Mr. Difficult essay, which I would recommend reading because he, as far as I can tell, he gets all of his ideas from Franzen, which is kind of surprising. Franzen treats it as work, and well, what it comes down to largely, I think, and a very valuable essay to read is Ben Marcus' essay as a response to Franzen. Because I almost feel like in some sense this is just a replication of that, which is kind of disappointing and annoying. But it's the idea that, the Book Chemist falls into this category exactly. That I am the ideal reader. I, with my PhD in American literature, should be able to understand Gaddis. And if I can't, Gaddis messed up. Gaddis is being intentionally difficult. If I, a seasoned and academically verified good reader, can't understand it, then it's written incorrectly, which is, of course, absurd. And Franzen has that same mindset. You know, someone as supremely intelligent as me, and Gaddis is difficult? And I have an interesting anecdote. When I was taking a class on Cormac McCarthy, you know, everyone, oh, it's so difficult, he doesn't do punctuation, it's so hard to figure out. Because they just never read anything. Which isn't their fault, and it's not McCarthy's fault. It's just they're not the intended reader. That's it. It's that simple. Read it or don't. That's it. It's either for you or it isn't. Finnegan's Wake follows the same thing. But there was a student in my McCarthy class who was talking to another student. I just overheard them. And she said, you know, I'm conflicted because McCarthy makes me feel stupid, but I know I'm not stupid. So she was struggling with the idea that she wanted to dislike the work because it makes her feel stupid. But she knows she's not stupid. But she at least had the, you know, integrity of spirit to realize that she's not stupid. The work is what it is, and she's not stupid. Take the work as it is or don't. But just because something's difficult to understand doesn't mean that you're stupid. But in the sense that the author is probably older than you, and in certain cases probably more intelligent than you, it doesn't necessarily make you stupid. It makes you know less, or it means you know less. It means you need to learn more. It means you have something to learn from the writer, which I think is the greatest gift you can get, which, you know, goes into the reason I read, which I'll touch on in a little bit. This went on longer than I wanted to, but anyway, I think it's important because his video almost got 4,000 views already, which is horrifying. Calls it a paradox. It's the most Puritan book ever. All work and no fun. No entertainment, no human connection that you look for in books. He got annoyed and angry, which is kind of like pathetic. Like, why is your ego so tied up into it? But yeah, I think it comes down to, you know, he imagines himself as the ideal reader. You know, this is exactly what Franzen talked about, and it's just hilarious. You're not the ideal reader. You were not supposed to read it. Maybe it is just too hard for you, which is reasonable, you know? And the way I think about this, the best way I can, I think, explain it is, let's imagine that instead of something related to English and literature, you imagine something in physics. So, you know, Einstein worked for years on his theories of special and general relativity. And when they were developed and then published, almost no one understood them. The only people that could understand them were very sophisticated mathematicians and then a couple physicists. They read it, they worked on it, developed it, perfected it, so on. Then it got spread out to a more general audience. Einstein wrote something a little simplified, a little incorrect, but it made it easier to understand. Well, let's imagine that roughly 100 years later, someone reads, you know, let's say Einstein's original paper on special relativity and becomes indignant that Einstein should have written it in a simpler way. It feels like he's being intentionally difficult. It's Einstein's fault I don't understand it. That would be laughed out of the room. That is hilarious. Like, it's so ridiculous, it's not even funny. It's just so, like, barefaced, indefensible. But then, an exactly similar comparison to make is someone with a PhD in American literature saying it's Gaddis' fault that he doesn't understand the recognitions. That should be laughed out of the room. Especially the idea that it's Gaddis' fault. It's your fault. You should be a good reader by this point. Now, if your chief contention is that, oh, he's a pessimist and I don't like icky feelings, well, then why do you like David Foster Wallace and Thomas Pynchon? They're not optimists by any stretch. Pynchon did get a little bit in later life, but no intelligent person can be a strict optimist. It's just indefensible. So what is it then? If it's not, and if you think Gaddis is a complete misanthrope, then you can't read. That's it. You can't read. You are unable to read. Or you're blocked from reading for some reason. You're seeing what isn't there. So, yeah, as you can see, I completely disagree with it, and it's extremely annoying. Someone with such a reach, just giving so many indefensible misunderstandings of a book that I've read for years and enjoyed. Wouldn't be so bad if he didn't have his academic credentials and such a large following, if he was just some random person who didn't really know anything, saying all this stuff. It's just easy to write them off. Like, there's another review of this book who calls him William Gaddis. Better than food, he fucking lifts it like a weight. It's like, come on, guys. How are you not just ashamed of yourselves? But whatever. These people just don't even... It's just, yeah, this book just wasn't written for them. That's it. And it should just be obvious. Now, this is where I'm starting my late discussion on difficulty in books. So, and the way I see it for myself, just like I mentioned a little bit earlier, is that, I'm somewhat... When I started reading, I didn't realize what books were supposed to be difficult. I didn't realize which books had a reputation. I would just spend a lot of time in libraries and just look through the books. And if I saw one that looked interesting or was highly regarded or something like that, or, oh, you should read this, it's top 100 of 20th century, I would just read it. I would just try to read it. And I didn't realize that Ulysses was supposed to be difficult. I only realized parts of it were difficult when I read it. And I skipped those parts because they were too difficult for me at the time. The Oxen and the Sun. If you don't have a broad knowledge in English literature, you won't understand it to the extent that I think is necessary. So I skipped it, and I just read the rest. And I loved it. And then later, on my reread, which are necessary for good books, I understood it to the extent that I feel is valid to understand it. So I've always had that problem with this sort of reputational reading, like the Book Chemist definitely fell victim to, where it's supposed to be difficult and then that's your mindset going in. I just totally reject that whole mentality. Also, I think it's a disservice to tell students, especially younger students, that, oh, this is difficult, guys. We're going to get through it. It's going to be some work, but you can hang in there. Because if it's going to be work, it's going to be work no matter what. So why are you telling people it's going to be work? It's just going to be work. But there are many chances that you're telling people it's going to be work and it's not going to be work, but they're in the, kind of sheep mindset. People are herd animals that, oh, it will be work because someone else told me it was work. Someone who knows more than me, someone who's my teacher told me it's work, therefore it's work. And then they have to get out of that mindset. Why so many people dislike Shakespeare when there's really no good reason to dislike Shakespeare. So that's the introduction to difficult works, I think, is a huge mistake, just huge mistake. Finnegan's Wake has that same exact problem. And I've never felt this, where I have to conquer a difficult work or whatever. I even kind of held off from thinking of Shakespeare as an excellent writer for a while, because to me, he wasn't. He had to basically, in some sense, prove to me that he was a great writer. And of course it did happen. But also with Joyce, I loved Ulysses since I read it. The writing style is perfect. So even if you don't understand anything, you can enjoy the language. If you have even an ear for language, which some people don't, so they won't enjoy it. But with Finnegan's Wake, I just didn't read it for a while because I knew it was too difficult for me, which is perfectly fine, but I didn't get this huge chip on my shoulder that's an insult to my intellect that he wrote a difficult book. It's just difficult, that's it. Some people are smarter than you, some people are older than you. You won't understand everything. Listen to a mathematics lecture on the YouTube channel of Institute for Advanced Study. It's not an insult to my intellect that I don't understand anything they're saying. It's just some beautiful outgrowth of humanity that you can appreciate even through the slight lens that you're able to. And then eventually, after a few years, when I became pretty well read, I read Finnegan's Wake and looked into Indo-European linguistics and comparative mythology and learned a little bit about Irish history and read Ulysses again and Dubliners and Portrait of the Artist. Got into a Finnegan's Wake reading group, and now I feel perfectly fine reading Finnegan's Wake. Of course, it's difficult. That does remind me of this kind of hilarious thing that the book chemist said, that he would keep Finnegan's Wake on his bedside table and try to read it every year, which is, just kind of pathetic in itself. That shows what kind of mindset he had, but which I never had. And Gaddis has this type of reputation, which I never really bought. With any decently written author, you will have to adjust to their language and their worldview. Like for me, with Walt Whitman, when I first started reading Walt Whitman, it wasn't really clicking with me. I would read it, and of course I'd get the language and the symbols and stuff and the meaning, but it just didn't really, I didn't fully absorb it. And then maybe a month later, as I was still reading it, and then I just fully understood it. I had to acclimate myself to his language and his worldview. But Whitman is not a difficult writer. For some reason, he's not considered difficult, which he is as difficult as any of these other people. I think people just think they understand him, but they don't. And then you experience this with, Melville. People think they understand him, but he's as I extrapolate people's idea of what's difficult, Melville is a difficult writer. Whitman is a difficult writer. Who else? Let's see. Shakespeare is a difficult writer. Chaucer is a difficult writer. Because they give you non-trivial explanations of the complexity of life, which I think is an extremely admirable reason to create art. Try to represent your reality as justly as you can, in the most accurate way possible, kind of maybe viewed as more of a scientific view of art in a way, but not necessarily. It's pre-scientific too, pre-scientific revolution. But this idea is influenced by Erich Auerbach, mimesis. Kind of viewing artwork as the representation of reality of the time that it's written in and of its time. And it really just comes down to why do you read? Why are you reading? I read because I want to understand the world better. I read because I love language. Ever since I was little, I've had favorite words. And I realized from the wide-eyed looks of my friends when I asked them what their favorite word was, that not everyone has favorite words. I didn't realize that, not everyone has favorite words. Some people are tone deaf and they can't write music. Not everyone's creative necessarily, in the sense that, good writers are creative, I like to write. I write poetry. I love poetry. Some people don't like poetry. I can't imagine how you can't like poetry, but some people don't, so that's it. And I don't expect those people to like the books I like. But when someone, imagines themselves as someone who is a good reader and all this stuff, and then has to explain to themselves why they don't like poetry, or why they don't like this writer that they're supposed to like, or whatever, that's when you get these extremely convoluted, articles and defending their own intelligence, and just kind of pathetic displays that you just have to put up with. And also, I think a part of this is, I come from a completely working class, like lower middle class background. All of my grandparents were factory workers, or kind of like that. And then my parents were the first in their generation to go to college. Neither of them used their degrees. Went to kind of small community college or local regional college, and didn't use their degrees. I had to pay my way through university, and I pretty much hated it the whole time. People had these ridiculous views. It would always be the distinction of having read almost nothing, but having this pompous view of art. Like people get radicalized kind of in a sense, which is interesting because I think some people might think this about me, but I couldn't, I was completely alienated at school, even though a lot of the people imagine themselves this way, these people that collect every edition of Jane Austen, and, can't understand the Fairy Queen or something like that, or couldn't really work out linguistics, So I've always felt the separation from this kind of cultured feeling, even though, to my absolute amazement, somehow I end up liking books, and I love classical music, which are two, cultured things. I'm supposed to be rich because I like those things. But then, of course, tons of my interests have nothing to do with being cultured. I love folk music, and my grandparents are absolutely not in that direction at all. And I love their slang terms in Southern. They both grew up on farms, and I love their stories. And that's how I am. That's how I see myself. That's my heritage, and that's who I am. So I've noticed a lot of people who get into literature, they're like pseudo, pseudo upper class or something like that. They go to college, go to a good college, and they adopt an accent or something, and then they read Derrida and all this ridiculous stuff, and they want to impress their teachers, and they want to impress their classmates. And it's like a social game. They want to get interesting tattoos and go to the cool coffee shop. And I saw all of this in my school, and I was just so disgusted by it, and I just separated from it. And even apart from that, a lot of the teachers feel that way. I had a teacher, and this is so hilarious. He was a good teacher. He was an excellent Milton scholar. But it's one of these unbelievable ironies where he loved Milton, he loved Shakespeare, but he thought Joyce was needlessly obscure. And it's okay, yeah, sure, Joyce is to an extent needlessly obscure. But you'd have to answer why he's needlessly obscure before you just throw him out the window. But then John Milton had to write summaries of his books of Paradise Lost because no one understood it at the time. So why don't you throw Milton out the window for being needlessly obscure? He could have just written a little pamphlet. Or, he could have written a history of the Civil War rather than an allegorized version that talks about the most important questions in humanity. It's why is it that you have to be insulted by someone who's smarter than you? That's what I've never understood. Some people are just smarter than you. Some people are just smarter than me. Joyce is one of them. Cormac McCarthy is one of them. William Gaddis is one of them. It gets a little bit harder when you go back in time to Shakespeare or Chaucer. They're smarter in some ways, but of course you can't really tell they're smarter in other ways because it just doesn't really compute. We have a different type of intelligence now, mainly. But I wonder, a lot of people don't want to believe that these people are smarter than them. No, but why? Whenever it's objectively the case. William Gaddis is objectively, barefaced more intelligent than the book chemist. And he also is objectively more intelligent than me, which is perfect because then we have an opportunity to learn from him. It's just like the greatest gift in life. These people who are much smarter than most of us write a huge book that we can just read and learn from. It's really like a massive gift, and I think that's one of the highest aspirations you can have. And there's your salvation through art, that you pass these works through hundreds and thousands of years. We have the Iliad and Plato and Aristotle all the way through to today, that give us a chance to do anything. If we didn't have them, we would have never had anything that we have in our current day. So yeah, and I think there's a distinction that is made between Franzen makes this distinction, which is a fake distinction, but it's about readers of contract, which it's like, okay, this is what I want, and you're going to give it to me. Like you're saying, you speaking to the imaginary author. I want, a thriller. This is genre fiction, or literary genre fiction or whatever. Of course, you can do it with other stuff, and Shakespeare's plays fall into this to an extent, but, I want to be confused in the first half, and then I want to think I know what's going on, and then I want to be thrown off even more right before the climax, and the climax reveals everything to me, and then we have our, close, and everything's all good by the end. That's contract, and then he has this imagined thing of status, which I'm sure to him exists, but to me doesn't exist. That writer has a distinction from the last one, that a writer is intentionally difficult and has to be shown off in coffee shops, and you're supposed to tell your friends about it, and you just mention that you read it, but you never actually talk about it, and all this type of stuff. And that's his world, but I would never in my life have imagined a dichotomy between those two things. Because you can imagine a contract being, I want you to impress me with language that I could have never come up with myself. I want you to give me ideas on the world that I could have never come up with, on my own. I want you as a author to provide a profound question on humanity and our struggle through this minute existence that we have in comparison to the other 7 billion of us here, or something. That's just as much of a contract as just give me the Deus Ex Machina and end in a happy way, okay? That's just as much of a contract. So it's just obviously a fake distinction written, and anyway, so yeah, I just think I reject the premises that, oh, there's a difficult writer, this person's not difficult. And I think the book chemist should delete his video. It's an embarrassment. He should be embarrassed by it. It should be detrimental to his reputation as a so-called scholar of American literature. Yeah, and if you haven't already, read Gaddis, because he's one of the best writers you'll ever read. And I think I'll end it here. I wish this was more eloquent, but I didn't want to write a script down and talk like that. So anyway, let me know what you think. I tried not to be too harsh, but this is extremely annoying to me, and I'm sure it came through a little bit. And also, even this whole conversation about difficulty, I just don't buy it. I always have to listen to it, and I try to think about it a little bit to try to understand other people's perspective, but I just reject the whole, argument. I reject the whole facade around it. I think it's a parasite on reading. It's unnecessary, can be easily done away with. If a book is difficult for you, it's difficult for you. It doesn't matter if you tell other people that it's difficult. If you don't want to read it, don't read it. If you do, just read it, whatever. It's, what's the point? It's like, if a state park is far away, it's far away. If you want to drive there, drive there. If you don't want to drive there, don't drive there. That's it. It's like, I don't know. That's how I see it, so. Anyway, okay. Death is a gang boss.